I still remember the first time I drove into that neighborhood. The streets were perfectly clean, the lawns were manicured like they belonged in a magazine, and every single house looked like it had been painted in a single, neutral color picked by someone who probably thought neon was a sin. You know the type. The kind of neighborhood where even the mailboxes look like they've had therapy sessions with an interior designer. As I rolled past the third house, I noticed her. Karen, the HOA president, clipboard in hand, glaring at me like I had just parked a monster truck on her prize-winning tulips. She came marching down her driveway in those ridiculous heels that clicked with military precision. You know the type, the kind of person who believes a clipboard is a weapon of mass destruction. "Sir," she barked as soon as I stopped in front of my new house. "Do you know you're required to follow the HOA rules? You need to pay your dues immediately, mow your lawn exactly twice a week, and your mailbox, yes, your mailbox, does not conform to community standards." I blinked at her, took a sip of my coffee, and then I said it calmly like I was discussing the weather. "I'm not in your HOA." Her eyes went wide. I could almost see the smoke starting to curl out of her ears. "Excuse me," she repeated, clutching her clipboard as if it had suddenly become the only thing keeping her alive. "I'm not in your HOA," I said again, slowly, deliberately. "I just bought the house across the street, so technically I'm not obligated to follow your rules." She froze. For a second, I thought maybe she had fainted. But no, she just looked like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water over her entire worldview. "Not in the HOA. That's impossible," she stammered, her voice quivering like a violin in a horror movie. "Everyone here is in the HOA." I shrugged, smiling politely. Apparently not everyone. At that moment, Karen did what any sensible HOA president would do in a crisis of faith. She reached for her phone and started dialing. Slowly, deliberately, like calling the police was going to fix the universe. "Who are you calling?" I asked, tilting my head like a curious cat. "The authorities," she spat out. "You are breaking community rules. This is illegal." I couldn't help it, I laughed. Not a loud laugh, but the kind of laugh that makes people question if you're sane. "Illegal? I'm pretty sure buying property isn't illegal. But hey, maybe your definition is different." By this time, a few neighbors had started to peek out from behind curtains and blinds. Some whispered to each other. Some were already taking bets on how fast Karen was going to lose this battle. I could almost feel their amusement radiating through the street. Karen jabbed the air with her phone. "They'll be here any minute, you'll see. You can't just ignore the rules." "I'm not ignoring anything," I said, taking another slow sip of coffee. "I just don't have to follow your rules, yet." Her jaw tightened, her face turning a shade of red I didn't know was physically possible. You could practically hear her brain screaming, "This is not how things are supposed to go." And in the background, the neighborhood was quietly holding its breath. Some were trying to hide smiles, others were shaking their heads like they had front-row seats to a weird, unplanned sitcom. As I set down my coffee and leaned casually against the hood of my car, I felt a strange satisfaction. There's a certain thrill in watching someone who's always been in control realize, for the very first time, that they aren't. And Karen, she had never looked less in control in her entire life. By the time I got my keys out and stepped toward the front door, Karen was on the phone, probably explaining that a law had been broken somewhere somehow. The suspense of waiting for her next move was almost delicious. Every step I took toward my new house felt like walking toward a small victory, one that Karen was about to understand, though she wouldn't do it gracefully. And that's when I realized this neighborhood, so quiet and pristine, was about to become the stage for one of the most absurd battles I had ever witnessed. And somehow, I was already winning. I was just unlocking my front door when I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens winding through the neighborhood. A flash of red and blue lights reflected off the perfectly polished mailboxes. I turned slowly, coffee in hand, and saw 2 police cars roll to a stop in front of my house. Karen, of course, was already waving them over like a general calling reinforcements. Her clipboard now looked more like a battle standard than ever. The officers stepped out, looking confused, scanning the neighborhood as if they had entered some alternate universe. One of them approached cautiously. "Afternoon, sir. We got a call regarding an HOA dispute." I smiled, trying not to laugh. That's one way to put it. "Hello, officers. I just moved in across the street. I'm apparently not in their HOA, and that seems to be a problem." The taller officer raised an eyebrow. "Not in the HOA, that's unusual." "Unusual, maybe. Illegal, I don't think so." I took a slow sip of coffee. "But let's hear the other side, shall we?" Karen immediately jumped in, pointing at me as though the motion itself would make the officers believe her. "He refuses to comply. He won't pay fees, won't follow the rules, and he's ignoring the community standards." The shorter officer looked between us, clearly trying to figure out if he had walked onto a reality TV set by accident. "Community standards," he repeated. "Yes, rules, regulations. The HOA has authority over every resident here." Karen waved her clipboard dramatically, like she was summoning the law itself. I stayed calm. Leaning against the doorframe like this was a casual conversation, not the opening act of a neighborhood drama. "Actually, officers, it's a bit more complicated. I recently purchased a few properties in the neighborhood, so technically, I'm not just any resident. I'm the new landlord of some of these houses." There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable pause. You could practically see the officers' brains short-circuiting. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a goldfish, her clipboard quivering in her grip. The taller officer squinted at me. "You own the properties?" "Yes," I said, taking a deliberate sip of coffee. "Including the one you're standing on, Karen." Karen gasped, fumbling with her phone as if she had just realized it wasn't plugged in. That's not possible. I run this neighborhood. I enforce the rules." "You enforce the rules," I said evenly. "Technically, over property I now own." I gestured to the houses around us. "Every HOA regulation you're trying to use against me, legally I have control over the land now. So this argument, well, it's a little backward." The officers exchanged a glance. I could see one trying not to smile, the other trying not to laugh outright. It was that delicate mix of amusement and confusion that comes when grown adults are suddenly dethroned by a newcomer. Karen, however, was not about to give up. "You can't just, this is a community, you have to follow rules, everyone does." "Everyone except me," I said, nodding politely. "For now, anyway." I could see her internal panic growing. Her rules, her clipboard, her sense of control, they were all meaningless now. The taller officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, technically, he's correct. If he owns the properties, you don't have the authority to enforce HOA rules on him." Karen froze, jaw slack, clutching her clipboard like it could save her. He. I smiled and held up a hand. "Take a breath. I'm not here to fight. I just thought I should introduce myself before things escalated." The suspense hung in the air. Every neighbor within sight was now peeking through windows or over fences. You could feel the tension like static electricity, except the funny kind, where everyone knows the punchline is coming, but no one wants to miss the drama. Karen finally muttered something into her phone, probably trying to salvage authority that no longer existed. The officers stood there, awkwardly holding their hats in their hands, unsure whether to issue a warning, laugh, or politely leave the scene. I leaned casually against the car, sipping my coffee again. "Look, I'm new here, I promise to be a good neighbor. But for now, maybe it's best to take a step back and rethink the rules you're trying to enforce. On my property." Karen's face turned a shade of red I didn't think was physically possible. The officers shifted uncomfortably. The neighbors whispered, some trying to hide smiles. And me, I felt a quiet thrill. Because for the first time, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, was realizing she might not be in charge after all. And I had just arrived. After the officers had stood there for what felt like an eternity, quietly processing the fact that an HOA president could be outmaneuvered before lunch. I decided it was time to drop a little more information. Actually, I said, turning to Karen with the faintest smile, there's something you might want to know. It's a bit unusual. Her eyes narrowed, the kind of look that says, if you say one more word, I might call the cops again, or worse, cry. She clutched her clipboard. Unusual? What do you mean by unusual? I gestured toward my house, the one I had just moved into. That one isn't the only property I purchased. Karen blinked, slowly, then blinked again. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard as if she were trying to squeeze out the words that would explain this away. You purchased more than one, she asked cautiously, almost afraid of the answer. Yes, I said. I acquired several properties in this neighborhood over the past few weeks. The pause that followed was delicious. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like she was searching for some magical loophole in the universe. The officers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other as if to say, do we intervene, or do we just let this unfold? One neighbor, a lady who had been peeking out from her curtains the whole time, let out a quiet laugh. Karen shot her a glare that could have frozen fire, but the woman immediately ducked back, stifling her amusement. I could feel the collective tension in the street starting to bend toward comedy. You own houses, Karen repeated slowly, trying to make the words sound real in her own head. Yes, including the one you're standing on, I added lightly, gesturing toward her. Her face went pale. I swear I could almost see the wheels in her brain grinding, sparks flying like she was trying to calculate how she could possibly regain authority. But she couldn't. Not this time. Wait, she stammered. That's impossible. You can't just, how did you even? I did it legally, I interrupted, keeping my tone calm, casual, and just a touch smug. Deeds, contracts, bank statements, all perfectly valid. I followed the rules exactly as they're written. Karen's hands trembled. The clipboard wobbled like it was about to topple to the ground. The officers glanced down at their notes, unsure whether to take control or just watch the meltdown. One of the officers cleared his throat. Ma'am, if he owns these properties, the HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over them. You technically cannot enforce your rules on him. Karen's face twisted, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. That's not how things work. I took a slow sip of my coffee and leaned against the car again, just like a neighbor having a casual chat over the fence. Actually, it is how things work. Rules only apply to those within the HOA, and well, now I own the properties. So technically, I'm beyond your reach. The tension in the street was palpable. Neighbors were peeking out from behind curtains and doors, whispering to each other, trying not to laugh too loudly. Even the officers were struggling to maintain their professional composure. Karen, however, was in full panic mode. She was packing, pointing at me, muttering under her breath, and even flicking the clipboard like it might magically restore her authority. You can't just own everything. I smiled faintly. Well, I did, legally, and since I now control these properties, I guess the next steps are up to me. Karen's jaw dropped further. She realized at that exact moment that everything she had relied on, her rules, her meetings, her authority, was suddenly irrelevant. The neighborhood she thought she controlled was now partially mine, and the implications were sinking in slowly, like a cold splash of reality. The officers shifted again, exchanging glances. One of them muttered something under his breath about the weirdest HOA case ever, which, honestly, I couldn't have agreed with more. I could see Karen calculating her options, none of which were good. Every second that passed added to the suspense, the feeling that a storm had quietly arrived in the perfect, pristine streets. And me, I was just standing there calm, watching her unravel, knowing that this neighborhood would never be the same. By the time she muttered, I need to see proof, I knew the next act had begun. It was going to be fun. Karen's eyes were wide now, the kind of wide that makes you think someone might need an oxygen mask just to breathe. Her clipboard was shaking in her hands like it had just realized it wasn't going to save her from reality. She finally whispered, almost pleadingly, "I need proof. Show me the proof." I nodded. Of course, I wouldn't want anyone to think I'm making this up. I walked over to my car and retrieved a neat stack of documents. Deeds, contracts, bank statements, all arranged in order as if I were preparing to teach a real estate seminar. I handed the first document to Karen. She glanced at it, then back at me, then back at the document again. This can't be real," she said, her voice trembling. "It is," I replied evenly. "Every purchase was legal and recorded, every transaction, and every property in this stack now belongs to me." The officers leaned in, clearly fascinated. The taller one gave a discreet nod to the shorter one, like he was silently saying, "Yep, that's legitimate. You can't argue with this." Karen's face went through a rapid series of colors, red, white, red again, like some kind of emotional traffic signal. She tried to stammer out an objection, but the words caught in her throat. She pointed at the first page. These don't, these can't." "Yes, they can," I said gently, "and they do." I handed her the next document. This one was a contract showing the closing dates for multiple properties in the neighborhood. She flipped through it, her eyes scanning frantically, trying to find a loophole, a typo, anything she could use to regain control. The officers watched quietly, trying to maintain professional composure while clearly struggling not to grin. One of them muttered under his breath, probably thinking this was some kind of practical joke. I leaned casually against the car again, sipping my coffee. I understand it's a lot to process, but the reality is simple. I own these properties, and technically, the HOA has no authority over them. Karen's voice rose an octave. This is impossible. I've been running this neighborhood for years. I enforce rules, Yes, and you do a remarkable job enforcing them, on properties that aren't mine anymore, I said. I have nothing against the HOA itself, Karen, but the rules you're waving around, they don't apply here. Her hands shook. The clipboard nearly slipped from her grip, and I caught it before it hit the ground. I handed it back gently. Here, you might need this for emotional support. The neighbors were now quietly peeking through their windows, whispering to each other, trying not to laugh outright. You could almost hear their thoughts. Wow, she's finally been dethroned. The officers shifted awkwardly, glancing between Karen and me. "Ma'am," the taller one said slowly, "legally, he's correct. You can't enforce HOA rules on someone who owns the properties outright. The documents speak for themselves." Karen's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and frustration, like she was trying to unsee the proof. I could almost hear her thinking, "This isn't happening. I'm supposed to be in charge here." I smiled faintly. "Take a moment if you need it. I know this is a lot to digest." She muttered under her breath, fumbling with her phone, probably calling some higher authority or trying to find a loophole in real estate law that didn't exist. The officers just shook their heads slightly, probably thinking, "Yep, this is going to be a long day." I glanced around at the neighbors, some peeking from windows, some standing cautiously behind fences, all watching this little drama unfold. The suspense in the street was thick, almost tangible, like static electricity before a storm. Karen's finally voice, shaky and defeated, said, "I don't know what to do." I nodded, keeping my voice calm and measured. "That's perfectly fine. Sometimes realizing the rules you've been enforcing don't apply to someone can be disorienting." And just like that, the first real cracks appeared in the armor of the neighborhood's self-appointed queen. The clipboard trembled in her hands, the officers shifted uncomfortably, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. Because the next moves in this neighborhood were now mine to shape. Karen's hands were still shaking as she held the stack of documents. The clipboard that had been her symbol of authority now looked like a child's toy in a tornado. She paced back and forth, muttering under her breath, each word more frantic than the last. I watched, leaning casually against my car, coffee in hand, feeling a mix of amusement and satisfaction. You can't just own all these houses," she finally shouted, pointing at me like accusing a magician of cheating. "I enforce the rules. This neighborhood depends on me. You can't just." "Technically I can," I said, interrupting her, keeping my tone calm, measured. "And I did, legally. Every step was above board. No rules broken, no corners cut." Her jaw dropped, and she gripped her clipboard as if sheer force could undo what I'd done. The neighbors were now openly peeking from windows and porches, some trying to hide smiles, others whispering to each other. You could practically hear the collective, floating down the street. One of the officers, trying not to get involved in what was rapidly becoming a spectacle, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I hate to say it, but legally, he's correct. If he owns the properties, the HOA doesn't have authority over him." Karen's eyes bulged. I don't care about legalities. The HOA has rules, community standards, order. You can't just own everything. That's not how this works. I took another slow sip of coffee. Actually, it is how it works. Property ownership tends to trump HOA authority. You've run the neighborhood according to the rules you enforce, which is impressive, but now, well, those rules don't apply to me, or to the houses I own. Her face turned redder than a fire truck at this point, and I swear you could almost see steam rising from her ears. The officers shifted awkwardly, exchanging looks that said, "Yep, this is officially the weirdest HOA case we've ever seen." Karen's muttering grew louder until she was practically shouting at her clipboard. You think you can just change everything? I will fight this. I will." I held up a hand. "No need to fight. I don't want a war. I just want to introduce myself properly. Think of it as friendly neighborhood governance, just with me in the driver's seat for some of the properties." Her eyes narrowed. "Driver's seat? You think you can control this neighborhood? You can't even follow you." I smiled faintly. "Actually, I can, and I will, fairly, just differently than you've been doing it. No threats, no fines, no unnecessary rules, just logic and common sense." Karen's panic reached full tilt. She started flipping through the documents again, muttering, No, this isn't legal, this isn't real." Meanwhile, the neighbors were now openly whispering, some peeking over fences, others leaning out of windows, watching the chaos. One elderly man even shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "I've lived here 20 years, never seen anything like this." Karen finally threw up her hands, muttering, "I can't, this isn't how it's supposed to be. I'm in charge, I." I shook my head sympathetically. "You were in charge, for years, impressive work really, but now the reality is a little different. Sometimes authority comes with boundaries, and sometimes those boundaries are legal documents." Her face went pale. Her fuming had reached a level that I could almost hear her brain trying to recalculate every HOA meeting, every rule she had enforced, every threat she had made, and realize it no longer applied. The tension was thick, a mix of disbelief, anger, and the slow dawning that her control was gone. The officers cleared their throats again. "Ma'am, it might be best to take a moment. Let the reality sink in." Karen blinked rapidly, looked around the street at the neighbors, and then muttered, "I need to rethink everything." I took one last sip of coffee, smiled, and leaned back against the car. The suspense in the street was palpable. Karen's panic had shifted the power dynamic entirely, and everyone watching knew it. This neighborhood, so meticulously controlled for years, had just been flipped upside down, and the fallout was only beginning. For the first time, I realized just how much fun it could be to quietly watch someone who's always held all the cards realize they no longer do. And I wasn't even done yet. By now, Karen's flustered state had reached full-blown chaos. She was packing back and forth, muttering to herself, shaking the clipboard like it was a lifeline, while the neighbors watched with barely contained curiosity. I leaned casually against my car, sipping coffee, enjoying the unfolding spectacle. I decided it was time to take the next step, not out of malice, but to make the neighborhood functional again. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice calm, I don't want to embarrass you, but now that I legally own several properties here, including yours, well, I have the ability to help guide the neighborhood in a fairer way." Her eyes widened again, if that was even possible. "Guide the neighborhood? You think you can just control everything?" I smiled faintly. "Not control everything. Just to make sure rules are reasonable and residents aren't constantly stressed out over arbitrary fines or impossible regulations." The officers exchanged glances, clearly trying not to smile. Karen didn't seem to notice. She was too busy fuming and trying to think of some way to regain authority. "You can't just, oh no, this is illegal." "No, Karen," I said, setting my coffee aside. "Completely legal. I followed every step in the book. But since I now own these properties, the rules you've been enforcing over the years don't apply to me. And that's okay. Sometimes rules need context, and sometimes they need a human touch." The neighbors were leaning further out of windows and over fences now. I could hear the faint hum of whispers. Is she really going to argue with the owner? How is this happening? It was almost surreal, the way everyone seemed to recognize the shift in power without a single word being needed. Karen's face twisted in frustration. "But the HOA rules, they're important. For the community, you can't just change things." "Oh, I'm not here to change things arbitrarily," I said, walking slowly down the sidewalk, gesturing toward the houses. "I'm here to make them fair, reasonable for everyone. And yes, that includes you, Karen, because technically you're a resident now, not a ruler." She froze mid-step, as if my words had struck her like a lightning bolt. You could see the realization dawning. The clipboard no longer held power. The rules she enforced were irrelevant to me, and her authority was slipping away faster than she could grasp. I took a deep breath. "Look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. I prefer the easy way. I want a neighborhood where residents are happy, where everyone follows rules that make sense, and where no one wastes hours arguing over nonsense." Karen's lips trembled and she muttered, This isn't how it's supposed to be." The officers, who had been quietly watching the whole time, shifted again. One cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you might want to reconsider your position. Legally, he's right. Your authority over him isn't valid. Arguing further won't change that." Her head whipped toward him, then back to me, like she was trying to reconcile two opposing realities. This can't be happening." I smiled faintly. "It is happening, but it doesn't have to be a disaster. In fact, it can be quite pleasant. I'm just asking for cooperation and a bit of patience while we adjust." The suspense in the neighborhood was thick. Every neighbor watching now knew something historic was happening. Karen, who had spent years asserting authority over tiny details, was suddenly powerless. And I was standing there, calm, measured, and fully aware of the dramatic irony. I gestured to the properties. "I'll be fair. I'll maintain the integrity of the neighborhood, but we're going to do it logically, with common sense. The petty arguments, the arbitrary fines, that's over." Karen's shoulders slumped, the first hint of defeat showing. For the first time, she was listening, really listening to someone else who had authority, and that someone else was me. And in that quiet moment, I realized something important. The neighborhood had shifted. Not because I wanted to humiliate anyone, not because I wanted drama, but because fairness and legality had finally won over outdated pride and arbitrary power. Karen didn't speak. She just stared at me, the clipboard sagging in her hands. And I knew, from the faint trembling in her jaw, that the next chapter in this neighborhood was about to begin, and I was going to be the one quietly writing it. A few days after the initial confrontation, I decided it was time to take the next step. Karen had retreated to her house, probably trying to figure out how to regain some semblance of control, and the neighbors were quietly buzzing about the events that had unfolded. The tension was still palpable, but I wanted to turn it into something productive, and maybe a little entertaining. I sent out a casual notice. Neighborhood welcome meeting, all residents invited. No hint of drama, no threats, just a polite invitation. Of course, Karen was the first to respond, glaring at the email like it was a personal attack. On the day of the meeting, I set up chairs in the small common area of the neighborhood, a table with refreshments, and a stack of folders with updated neighborhood guidelines. Nothing harsh, nothing humiliating, just clear, logical rules that made sense. Karen showed up, of course, striding in with her clipboard clutched like a shield. Her face was a mixture of suspicion and anger, but she kept her distance, probably hoping the neighbors wouldn't notice her presence. I started the meeting casually, smiling and greeting people as they arrived. "Thanks for coming, everyone. I just wanted to introduce myself properly. I recently purchased some properties here, and I thought it was important to talk about neighborhood guidelines and how we can make them fair for everyone." The neighbors listened intently. A few whispered to each other, clearly amused that the infamous Karen, queen of fines and flower regulations, was now quietly watching the proceedings without her usual dominance. I handed out the folders and went over the key points. Rules that made sense, schedules for maintenance that actually matched reality, and guidelines for community spaces that emphasized cooperation instead of petty enforcement. Each suggestion was met with nods, murmurs of agreement, and even a few chuckles. Karen, of course, tried to interrupt at first. "You can't just, these rules don't cover everything, the HOA." I smiled gently. "Karen, I appreciate your dedication, but these rules are designed for fairness. Nothing arbitrary, nothing unreasonable. And since I legally own these properties, my role here is to ensure the neighborhood works for everyone, including you." Her face tightened. She was clearly frustrated, but had no legal or social footing to argue. The neighbors, meanwhile, were trying hard not to laugh, some giving me discreet thumbs-ups as she sputtered. I continued, calmly and firmly, explaining how future disputes would be handled, how fees, if any, would be reasonable, and how communication would be direct rather than bureaucratic. The tension in the room shifted. Karen's aura of control faded with each logical statement. She was no longer the figure everyone feared, she was just another resident, forced to listen. At one point, I looked directly at Karen. "I know this is hard to take in," I said casually, "but it's really not personal. The neighborhood just needs structure that works for everyone. Sometimes, being in charge isn't about yelling the loudest, it's about listening and leading fairly." Her lips tightened into a thin line, a small acknowledgement that she understood, even if she refused to say it out loud. The officers who had been called a few days ago weren't present this time, but I could imagine their smirks if they had been. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had completely changed. Residents were chatting, laughing, and even joking about the absurdity of the previous confrontation. Karen left quietly, still fuming but unable to argue, her clipboard swinging uselessly by her side. I gathered the folders and looked around at the neighbors, a sense of calm satisfaction settling in. The suspense had been resolved, not with humiliation or anger, but with fairness and quiet authority. Karen's era of arbitrary power had ended, replaced by logic, legality, and a subtle but complete shift in neighborhood dynamics. As I waved goodbye to the last of the neighbors, I thought to myself, sometimes the best victories are the ones that don't feel like victories at all. You don't need to humiliate anyone, you just need to step into the role they thought was impossible. And for this neighborhood, that was enough. And just like that, Karen had to accept her new reality, while the rest of the neighborhood quietly enjoyed the change, laughing among themselves at the irony of it all. Life in the neighborhood after that first confrontation was different. Not chaotic, not tense, just calm. It was like someone had turned down the volume on a radio that had been stuck on static for years. The lawns were still immaculate, the houses still pristine, but there was an underlying sense of balance now, one that didn't involve Karen wielding her clipboard like a scepter. Karen, of course, still walked the streets, still offered her opinions loudly, and occasionally muttered under her breath about respecting the rules. But the difference was, no one took her seriously anymore. The residents had witnessed the shift, understood the new dynamics, and quietly adjusted their expectations. Karen was still Karen, but she was now just a resident, a loud one instead of the neighborhood monarch. I took the time to introduce myself properly to each household, shaking hands, listening to concerns, and making small adjustments where needed. The HOA rules I implemented were reasonable, fair, and practical. No fines for random flower colors, no arbitrary fees for minor infractions, and definitely no more panic over mailbox heights. Just common sense. The first time Karen tried to enforce a rule again, it was almost cute. She marched toward a neighbor trimming their hedges slightly outside the imaginary boundary she had enforced for years. I happened to walk by, coffee in hand. "Karen," I said casually, "remember, we agreed on practical guidelines. Hedge length is fine." Her mouth opened, she sputtered, and then she sighed, realizing that her authority no longer applied here. She muttered something about paperwork, community integrity, and traditions, but even she knew it didn't matter. She turned and walked away, the clipboard dangling uselessly at her side. The neighbors, of course, quietly chuckled behind their curtains or from their lawns. Some of them even thanked me, quietly, for bringing some sanity back into the neighborhood. It felt surreal, like stepping into a story where logic had finally defeated bureaucracy. One evening, a few weeks later, I was walking past my properties when I noticed Karen tending to her flower beds. Not with the same dramatic flair as before, but quietly, almost humbly. I waved. She gave a tight-lipped nod in return. Progress, I thought. It was then I realized something important. The neighborhood hadn't changed because I had won against Karen. It had changed because fairness and reason had replaced fear and arbitrary rules. People could now enjoy their homes without worrying about absurd fines, mysterious regulations, or a clipboard-wielding vigilante. There were still moments of humor, of course. One morning, Karen tried to enforce a no-dog toys on the lawn rule, only to realize that I had owned the property where half the neighborhood's dogs played freely. She walked past, muttering, and one of the kids nearby shouted, "Karen, the law says nothing about squeaky toys." The neighborhood erupted in laughter. I just shook my head, smiling. I also made a point to remain approachable. People knew they could come to me with concerns or suggestions, and I listened. It wasn't about control anymore, it was about community. And strangely, the neighborhood felt warmer for it. People were talking, smiling, and even helping each other out more. The absurd tension that had defined Karen's reign had evaporated. And Karen, she adapted. Slowly, begrudgingly, but she did. She still held her opinions, still made suggestions, still carried the clipboard, but it was no longer a symbol of fear. It was just hers. And I let her keep it. After all, everyone deserves a little dignity, even when they've been dethroned. As I walked back to my car that evening, coffee in hand, I thought about how bizarre the situation had been. Police calls, legal documents, tense confrontations. It had all seemed like a storm, but in reality, it was just the beginning of something better. The neighborhood had survived its clipboard queen, and it had thrived. And I had learned something too. Sometimes the most satisfying victories aren't loud or dramatic. Sometimes they're quiet, logical, and just right. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today. I took a final sip of coffee, glanced around at the houses, the lawns, and the neighbors chatting on their porches, and smiled. Karen might still have her moments of panic or frustration, but for the first time, the neighborhood was at peace. And I was proud to be a part of it.